previously stated, the ACLU of Iowa believes that the death penalty is unconstitutional. But in a less legalistic sense, one thing I would ask the subcommittee and the committee as a whole and the legislature to consider is that should you proceed with the institution of this in Iowa, there are certain assumptions that have to be made. First of all, that every government officer throughout every step of this process must be right every time for our hands to be clean. That is an arresting officer, that is a prosecutor, that is a judge, that is a state public defender. If we can state with certainty that people in all of those government positions never make mistakes, then we're having a different argument than the one we're having today. So respectfully to the judicial system, to the prosecutors, to the state public defenders, to old defense lawyers like me, we make mistakes. In an instance in which a human life is at stake, we can't afford to. For that reason, along with the ACLU's well-known views on the constitutionality of the penalty itself, we respectfully ask that this bill not move to the committee, and if it does, that it be defeated. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much. So we have time for just a couple more. I just saw this hand go up now. Good morning, ma'am. Again, 2 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Karen Person. I'm speaking on behalf of League of Women Voters of Iowa. The League opposes capital punishment and its reinstatement in Iowa. I've given you all copies of my full remarks, so I'm not going to repeat and read through all of them, but I do want to point out the main issues are that it does not act as a deterrent murder, and in fact there's an inverse relationship between those states that do have the death penalty and their murder rate, and those states that don't have the death penalty and their murder rate. Capital punishment is also very costly. There was a 2016 study done for the state of Nebraska. It found that the death penalty cost an average of $23.2 million more per year in those states with the death penalty than those without, with alternative sentencing. So we would suggest a fiscal impact statement if you're going forward with this bill, which we hope you don't do. But the death penalty has a disproportionate impact on minorities, the poor, and those with intellectual disabilities. As has been previously stated, we already have a death penalty. Felony 1 conviction means that you are in prison until you die.
Thank you very much. Sir, I believe I saw you next. So coming up. Thank you. Again, sir, 2 minutes. If you could state your name, thank you.
My name is Ivan Weber. I have put in front of you a sonnet. I am a person of Hispanic descent. I am someone who has defended 3 murder in the first-degree cases, a lawyer in this state, and rather than repeat what I think are the great arguments that have already been made, I decided to just put myself in a quick poem for you. Executions are horrors from which Iowans have been free. Killing is clearly wrong. Upon this scripture and law agree. So why we return to state killing is hard to see. Capital punishment is a product of barbaric time, a remnant of uncivilized cultures of inhumane crime. Executions are at odds with true modern paradigm. Those who argue that death is justified for some ugly acts cannot justify their claim upon any recognized facts. Contrary to data, they move heedless of racial impacts. Minorities are convicted here with ease when tried. Prison numbers show the courts do not set prejudices aside. Killing is just wrong. Haven't enough people died? The death penalty's a blight, internationally rejected. It's an evil masked as good, from which we must be protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I think we have time for one more. Now I've seen your hand go up. So. Ma'am, please state your name and you'll have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Patty McKee and I'm from Des Moines. As a victim of a violent crime, I stand here opposed to the death penalty. I remember the terror I felt of a person's hands around my throat, squeezing my life's breath out of me. If it lasted much longer, I would not be before you today. If I died, it would have been to cover up another crime against me. It took me a long while to come to the point of forgiving the perpetrators. Forgiveness does not shove the crime under the rug or say that what happened to me wasn't devastating, but it is a way to heal. Vengeance does not promote healing. It just keeps the wound open and oozing. The death penalty is just state-sponsored vengeance. It will put blood on my hands and that of every taxpayer in Iowa. It brings us to the same level as a perpetrator. I don't want blood on my hands. I strongly urge you to oppose the reinstatement of the death penalty in Iowa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So that concludes our time for statements. Thank you all for offering your perspective. Representative Anderson, you have any statements you'd like to make?
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I worked with crime victims for 38 years before I came to the Capitol in 2013, including 30 years of work with the families of homicide victims. I can tell you that no mother, father, sibling, aunt, or uncle, or any person who loved those murder victims felt the loss felt that any loss was more heinous than their loss. I can tell you that. I'm here to state that I'm against the death penalty. The crime victims that I worked with were kind of split on this issue. Some wanted the person to die because of their deep emotional loss. Others didn't want to see anybody else die. The 7 reasons that I'm primarily against the death penalty, which are more professional reasons than emotional reasons, are that we risk executing an innocent person in our own names. Since 1976, there have been 1,414 individuals executed in the United States. 156 individuals have been exonerated from death row. So that's about 1 exoneration for every 11 executions. One exonerated man in Florida, Freddie Lee Pitts, said you can release an innocent man from prison, but you can't release him from the grave. We talk about the death penalty being a deterrent, and there are lots of studies that show that it is not a deterrent. In 2016, the murder rate per 1,000 people in states with the death penalty was 5.63. For 100,000 people in a state without the death penalty, it was 4.49. It does not deter murder. The death penalty is tainted by racial bias in its application. As hard as we might work to make it not be biased, Justice Harry Blackmun once said, "It shouldn't surprise us that the biases and prejudice that infect our society generally determine who is sentenced to death." The death row inmates in this nation, 42% are white, 41% are black, and 13% are Hispanic. The rest of the people of different ethnic backgrounds. Time and again, studies have shown that the death penalty is sought more often against people who kill white people. The race of the victim in a death penalty case is 76% white, 15% black, and 7% Hispanic. Of the convictions, black offenders on white victims, 287. Of the convictions that were looked at in this study, 287 were black offenders with white victims. When the offender was white and the victim was black, there were 20. As much as I don't like cost to drive our values, the death penalty costs too much, especially when we have life is life. In North Carolina, it costs $2.16 million per execution more than having a person with a life sentence. And not to think that that might be an outlier, in Texas it's $2.2 million per execution more than a life sentence. So it runs about the same in each state. Why would Iowa go backwards when the trend is to eliminate the death penalty? In this world, only 56 of 195 nations use the death penalty. The U.S. is the only Western country still using the death penalty. Nations with the most executions in order of the number of executions are China, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United States of America. It is not, the death penalty is not the Iowa way. Between 1934 and 1965, that's 131 years, Iowa had 48 executions. 45 were for murder and 3 were for rape. For 59 of those years, to be fair, Iowa had no death penalty. 59 of the 131 years, we had no death penalty. For the 6 years between 1872 and 1878, we had no death penalty. And for the 53 years since 1965, we've had no death penalty. In 1965, the Iowa legislature voted to abolish capital punishment. The House voted 39 to 29, the Senate voted 35 to 20. The bill was signed into law by Governor Harold Hughes. We've had many, many attempts at reinstatement. 1970, 1975, 1976, 1993, 1995, 1997, and 1998. Each time the legislature considered the death penalty, Iowans spoke their opposition loudly along with their spiritual leaders. The only purpose remaining that I can see for the death penalty is revenge. And frankly, my God is kinder than that. I believe that people can rot in prison. I don't have any trouble with that. I don't care if they ever see the light of day again, but I do not want to take the chance that we might be one of those states in which one exoneration is equal to 10 executions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Anderson. Representative